I hope that BYU students who come here to BYU, one of the things that they understand is that they're not the only religious people in the world. And the people around them, religious, non-religious, they're doing things in the world that matter, right? They're seeking to make change. They're seeking to solve real world problems. And so what we're trying to do with much of our interfaith effort is not to say, let's go do what they do, but let's learn what they do. And let's think about how can we, as disciples of Christ, actually accomplish work in the world with other people.
Welcome to the Why Magazine podcast, bringing you ideas, stories, and voices from Brigham Young University. I'm Whitney Archibald, and today we're going to talk to Andrew Reed, who teaches comparative religion and church history at BYU and serves as the chair of the BYU Council for Interfaith Engagement. We'll learn about some of the interfaith efforts happening at BYU, but also about what we can do to engage with and learn from people of other faiths. This episode was inspired by an article in the summer 2024 issue of Why Magazine called Friendship Among Faiths by Kate Hansen-Robertson. Andrew Reed grew up in a Latter-day Saint home where he had little exposure to other religions. After graduating from BYU with a degree in history, he pursued world and religious studies at Arizona State University, Oxford, and Cambridge, and learned more and more about the religions of the world. And the more he learned about interfaith interactions, the more curious he became. I started our conversation by asking Reed how he knew he wanted to pursue interfaith studies.
There was one moment, I guess, at Westminster Abbey when I was in a graduate program where I was listening to very high-profile religious and political leaders talking about interfaith and why it mattered or what was wrong with it or why it worked. And afterwards, a gentleman walked up to me and kind of asked who I was. I said, well, I'm a Christian. And he said, well, what kind of Christian are you? I said, well, I'm a Latter-day Saint. And then he immediately turned and he said, well, then you have nothing to offer this gathering, right? And just sort of walked away. And that kind of became a moment where I wouldn't say I put a chip on my shoulder, but it kind of gave me a project to think about, right? What could I offer an interfaith space as a Latter-day Saint? And that to me was kind of a driving question that continues to push me to think about these things still, 20 years later. So.
Right. And in another sense, it also can maybe help you not to do the same to other people, right? Like not to be so dismissive of their faith and to be curious about what any other faith has to offer, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that interfaith work demands of us is a sort of generosity of spirit, that anybody can teach me something.
Yeah.
Right? About ideas they have, beliefs they have, truths that they hold. And those may inform me in a way that deepens my own understanding of the human experience and the human search for God. And so in one sense, a very negative experience for me personally in interfaith turned into a kind of motivation to try to do something different.
So when you came back to BYU to teach, how did you get involved with interfaith efforts?
When I first arrived here, the Dean of Religious Education established the Council for Religious Outreach that was meant to think about what could BYU do in strengthening understandings of religion in the world. What does religion in public life look like, and how can BYU students experience that at a university that is not just a majority, but a dominant majority Latter-day Saint. The sort of motivation is to build relationships that can both appreciate someone else's religious experience and a religious tradition, but also deepen our own understanding of what are human beings looking for in the world in terms of religious life? What are they experiencing? And one of the things that's happened to me, and I think to many others, is we learned that we're not the only ones out here, right?
Yeah.
There are other people with the same problems, the same questions, right? How do I encourage my kids to find faith in God? How do I encourage my children to have hope that the world's not terrible?
Yeah.
Are there religious answers to the big questions? And turns out human beings have been doing this a long time. And collectively, we've come up with profound understandings of what truth is and how God works in the world. And I think that, to me, is one of the things that's so enriching is, I'm constantly seeing a way that someone else may do something in the same search for something that I'm searching for. If I'm searching for peace or joy or happiness or hope, there are religious communities that have teachings about how that can be attained or how that can be received. And sometimes they're different than mine, and sometimes they're very, very closely aligned to mine. So, there's a lot to learn.
What are some of the things you've done specifically with students?
The first kind of project that we started was to begin the Student Interfaith Association. We had about 45 people show up to the first meeting.
Wow.
Said, okay, there's something here, right? We didn't know what it was and what it was going to be, but there's something here. And for the next couple of years, we just kept it going in small ways, an activity here, a project here of some kind. And now today, it's just this amazing organization that students are so invested in. So projects that we've done with them, we have an ongoing relationship with Catholic Community Services up in Salt Lake City, where BYU students offer anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 hours a semester of service, feeding homeless, unhoused populations. We've taken a small group of students to California and to Washington on a trip where we were interviewing religious leaders and recording those interviews. So we recorded some really powerful interviews with the imam who traveled with Malcolm X for 7 years, with a Shia imam whose own family was persecuted by Saddam Hussein, and students got to see that. Last summer, we took 14 students to Boise, Idaho, and they invested themselves in learning about interfaith cooperation around the issue of homelessness and poverty. And they were serving in food banks and kitchens. They were cleaning beds in a shelter. They were learning from a state senator about what the Idaho state government is doing to address these questions. They were replanting these community gardens where individuals can grow their own food in rural Idaho. And they were learning about a wood chopping project that creates firewood for 80 families in a small rural town. They just saw action happening around very specific issues.
That's great.
It was just amazing. We just came back from a similar trip to Boston, and students were meeting with individuals who work on interfaith education at Tufts University and at Harvard. They were, again, working in shelters. It's sort of taken on a life of its own almost.
Well, it feels so powerful, just the idea of religions with very similar objectives and values coming together, and just the power of what can happen when you join forces and multiply your efforts. It's amazing.
Yeah, and that's I think that's, for many students and for myself included, that's one of the amazing kind of outcomes of this. Is I hope that BYU students who come here to BYU, one of the things that they understand is that they're not the only religious people in the world.
Yeah.
And the people around them, religious, non-religious, they're doing things in the world that matter, right? They're seeking to make change. They're seeking to solve real world problems. And so what we're trying to do with much of our interfaith effort is not to say, let's go do what they do, but let's learn what they do, and let's think about where BYU and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are uniquely situated, because of our experience, because of our theology, because of our understanding of doctrine and truth. In what ways does our pursuit of discipleship let us help in finding a solution? How can we, as disciples of Christ, actually accomplish work in the world with other people?
Yeah, and I'm so curious how your professional life, like doing this and immersing yourself in this, how that has enriched and changed your interfaith efforts on a personal level.
Yeah. It's hard to pull apart professional and personal in this space. Right. It really is. Because, what started as professional relationships to build a Jewish Latter-day Saint academic dialogue it was a very successful project academically, but those are some of my dearest friends, that have emerged out of that relationship. If I have a question about Judaism, I have 10 friends I can call and get an answer. If something happens in the world that affects my Jewish neighbors, there's people I have to reach out to and offer friendship, fellowship to, because of that, right? So in some ways, relationships have kind of changed who I am, and I think that's a great thing.
Yeah.
I think, professionally, I've been able to do some things, but each of those has lent itself to personal development as well. For me, the pursuit of discipleship has looked like extension of love to others. I remember we were bleaching mats at a shelter one time with students, and our clothes to this day still wear the bleach marks of that work. And every time I put on that shirt, I just think about the significance of what students were teaching me as we were doing that. And so, it's really hard to pull apart what is professional and what is personal here, because it's become sort of ingrained into just who I am and where I find value. Last week, we were sitting in a Shabbat service at a synagogue on Friday evening with a Jewish community, and it felt like being at home.
Wow.
The songs have become familiar. The scriptures that are read become familiar. And there's work to kind of process as a Latter-day Saint. How am I interacting with this, and what am I thinking about? But each time I kind of walk away going, okay, there's more I have to understand about my own faith, right? The transformative experience of interfaith lends itself to a deepened discipleship.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of those transformative elements. Like, what have been some of the blessings that have come into your life through even understanding the doctrines of some of these religions?
Yeah. There's a beautiful teaching within Judaism, tikkun olam, which is to heal or to mend a broken world. And I think about that a lot, and part of the motivations for the things that we choose to do, the things that I choose to work on, are the things that might help mend the world. I work on the history of anti-Semitism in my research, and it's easy to say, oh, well, anti-Semitism is something that happened a long time ago. It led to the Holocaust. But it still goes on, right? And I'm in settings frequently where someone may say something that has a kind of anti-Semitic tone to it. And I feel called to kind of help address that and think about it and educate and, strengthen someone's understanding of why that's not okay. So in one sense, it almost becomes a kind of vocation to stand up for my neighbor, right? That when someone's being attacked, we have an obligation as people of faith to recognize that divinity is being attacked in that, that the image of God is being attacked, and we have a responsibility to help there. I think there's also just comfort in knowing that there are good people around me. I remember I was with a couple of my children at a Saturday morning Jewish service, and the rabbi, recognizing that my daughter was around the age of 12 or 13, invited her to come up, and participate in the recitation of Torah with other bar and bat mitzvah students. And I just thought that was so meaningful that he, knowing who I am and the faith tradition I come from, didn't see a problem inviting my own daughter to join them. That's such a beautiful extension of friendship. We can invite someone else into our religious life without the expectation that they have to join us, in terms of membership or affiliation, but they can just be there with us and we can learn together. We take students every summer to a place called the Wolf Institute at Cambridge University.
Oh, okay.
And our students have developed really powerful friendships and mentorships with scholars there. One of the most kind of amazing things that our students have been able to do is to go and visit with an imam at the Cambridge Mosque. And it's a unique mosque. It's an eco-mosque. So it's a mosque that's thinking about how do you build a religious site in a neighborhood that is going to blend into the neighborhood well, that is going to be thinking about the environment, right? How can we store water from rain and things like that can be used to continue the life of the mosque, but sort of as people of faith, do we care about the environment? And and what solutions do we have? And I think our students are just kind of deeply touched by this idea. There are real world solutions that religious communities are thinking about, and there's a lot to learn in the process.
If we're trying to solve the same problems, looking to other traditions for the solution might be a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some of our own to offer, right? And that's the thing that, we've had students who are, they're at a dinner, or they're at a lecture, or they're meeting with a Cambridge professor one-on-one. And one of the things that our students do so incredibly well is help broaden somebody's perception of Latter-day Saints. In those settings. They can sit down at a table next to somebody who is pretty sure that any BYU student is there because they want to convert somebody. And it turns out they end up talking about how much they're enjoying being, in a place where they can explore different lives of faith and learn from people from other traditions. And all of a sudden, these people that are sitting at the table with them walk away going, I think I better think about Latter-day Saints differently, right? That wasn't what I expected. And that's an amazing thing, that students are there to learn, but they do a lot of teaching along the way in really unique ways.
Well, and I like that. I mean, that seems like the key to everything in these interfaith relationships is that you're learning and you're teaching, and it's this interchange between the two that where the true value is found.
Yeah. There is a kind of inquisitiveness, humility in interfaith settings where you have to go in saying, okay, I know certain things, I believe certain things to be true, but I have to sit and listen to somebody who sees the world differently, and just absorb what they're telling me. Let it just sit there. I don't have to refute it. It doesn't have to be a rebuttal of something that they say. It can simply be, let's just process what you're telling me. I'll have my opportunity to share with you what I think. But there's a kind of discourse that happens that has to be civil, that has to be based on in an experience of love. And as we do that, I think that's where the magic of interfaith is. People are there because they find meaning in what they're doing.
So cool. Yeah. And I love how that's mutual. I would love to talk about, I guess, at both a personal and then a community level, what people can do to just develop more interfaith relationships and talk about religion with those of other faiths.
I think oftentimes we think that we have to have some formal program for it, right? That in reality, interfaith usually starts in a one-on-one conversation, right? It's, you meet somebody for the first time, and somewhere in those first few hours of getting to know each other, who they are emerges, and you learn a little bit, and you go, okay, so there's a whole tradition behind this person that influences the way they think, right? Yeah. Whether they're Muslim or Catholic or Latter-day Saint or atheist, there's a whole world behind them that kind of informs who they are and the way they think about the world.
Yeah, and value system
to that person that I can't really figure out. And that's an invitation just to kind of be willing to sit with them in friendship. You don't have to start off and try to figure out all the religious differences in day one. Right. It could be, let's go have lunch, or come on over and we'll just visit. Something so simple is at the root of interfaith.
Yeah.
Because we as human beings often identify ourselves, in part at least, by our religious affiliation. If you want to know who every BYU fan is out in the world, just wear a BYU t-shirt or a hat to the airport and you'll find every one of them, right? And guess what? There's other symbols in the world that people have that can tell you who they are in some ways. In the way that they dress or a necklace pendant they might wear or something that can tell you who they are a little bit. And so as we learn to be more religiously literate with those things, we get some clues, and then we can start the conversation in kind of very normal and natural ways. So,
and people rarely think that you're nosy when you ask them questions about themselves. They want to talk about themselves.
Of course. It's fairly easy to have a conversation that opens itself up to conversations about faith and lived experience. There's a kind of willingness, I think, for those that are really interested in interfaith to say, okay, what's the thing that I could do that could extend to my neighbor, right? Mm-hmm. A sign of genuineness, of interest, of care, of love, whatever, right? And some of those revolve around life experiences. How many people get invited to a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah at some point? How many people get invited to a wedding or a funeral, right? Where it may happen in a different religious space.
Yeah.
Just attending those can be an opening for it. Or understanding the way that somebody might be grieving as part of their ritual life. All of those are kind of avenues in to just sort of say, there's a human experience happening here and I'm interested in what's going on. I also just strongly encourage individuals to say, I could go sit in my neighbor's worship service, whatever that may look like, and just be willing to enjoy that experience, kind of let it be, right? I'm not there to defend my faith. I'm not there to lose my faith. I'm just there to be a friend, right?
Yeah.
And as I learn to kind of absorb what's happening, I'm going to have a lot of questions for my friend. And I'm going to sit down and say, okay, I'm so interested in what's going on here. I don't understand what's happening, right? I remember, that oftentimes that process opens up for us questions that we didn't know we had.
Yeah.
We took a group of our Jewish academic dialogue partners to a sacrament meeting and to Sunday school. And afterwards, we had a chance to debrief with them. And one of them, I remember distinctly asked the question, we sat for an hour in this Sunday school lesson. And, the subject was about the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Why was nobody in the class questioning what the teacher was saying? And from some religious traditions, that's a very normal kind of process. Is we learn together, we ask questions of each other, we can disagree, and it's okay. And we just we're pursuing truth. Uh-huh. And in Latter-day Saint communities, we tend to be very, very, very polite.
Yeah.
To confront somebody or to raise an opposing view in Sunday school isn't really our normal activity. But it caused me to think about my own community and say, oh, why don't we do that? Right? Because clearly the teacher didn't know everything. So would it be okay to offer a different opinion? Right? And that's not to create, sort of Sunday schools that are just based in disagreement, but right. We just don't have it in our culture. It's just not something that we do in the same way. But yet it's a very Jewish way of learning, is to sit with a partner and to talk and read together and argue and offer opinions so that we can come to a better understanding of what's going on within that sacred text.
Yeah. And there's a lot of value in that. That's cool.
So I think as individuals, we just have to be open, right? Open yourself up to learning. One of the things I've learned from that is that I could do more to be a good host, more hospitable when there's visitors to my own community. What does it mean to welcome them in, and how can I help them feel more comfortable? So I think one of the things is just ask questions. There's just mountains of information on the internet. Go to the community's webpage and just sometimes they'll have like visitors. Here's what you should know, right? If I'm going to the mosque, they will often say, you want to have long sleeves, women, please have something you can cover your hair with. Those kinds of things are really useful, but they're readily available on the internet for us.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit about some of the common, maybe artificial stumbling blocks that we kind of create for ourselves. What are some of those other things that you think get in people's way that can be easily overcome?
Yeah. One of them is fear, right? Afraid of what I don't know. I was sitting in a synagogue during a service, and there was an older woman sitting next to me, and we were kind of going along, and and every time we'd change pages, she said, okay, now we're going to page 221, and now we're going to page 55, and we're saying this prayer, right? And I've done enough of those to kind of know the rhythm of it, but it was so nice that she was just knowing to help, in the same way that somebody sitting next to me in a sacrament meeting might say, okay, what happens next? And I'll say, oh, we're going to sing a hymn, or we're going to, now that we have an ordinance, the sacrament that's going to be passed, there's going to be bread, there's going to be water, right? Those are perfectly beautiful educational opportunities, and doing it well just means trying to understand, respect, and observe.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel like it's a lens through which to look at the world. Like just that maybe a different kind of curiosity that can be a beautiful thing. So I'm curious what successes you've seen in communities and what tips you have for those of us who would love to start kind of more ongoing relationships with other faiths in our communities.
Well, one of the things that's really quite amazing is that many communities have existing interfaith organizations. So, for example, here in Utah, the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable, they have events all the time, and they're open to the public. And you can go and you can learn. And we have Latter-day Saints who represent the church on those councils. So the church is already invested in this. BYU's invested in this, and then there's always community service projects. Sometimes it's a day of service or, different kinds of things that are happening, and look for opportunities to be involved in those. Those are really easy entrance points, right? Because you're going to be sitting there raking leaves with somebody and they're going to be from a different tradition, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes as Latter-day Saints, we want to kind of, when we go to something like this, we kind of pool together and we're like, okay, well, we'll do this, right? Challenge yourself to, step across the aisle in a sense and work with someone else. It can be a really rewarding experience, and it can teach us so much, right? It's a transformative experience to sit in someone else's community in a worship service of some kind and to feel inspired. God speaks to all of his children in many, many ways, and being inspired in someone else's sacred space is perfectly okay, right? It just means God's doing his work. There's always that work of reconciling that with what I feel on a regular basis in my own community, right? But it's okay to be inspired by something you see, right? By the stained glass window, by the beautiful hymn or the chanting or whatever it is. There's something there to offer us that isn't just educational, academic. It's also deeply personal and spiritual. And I think that, to me, is kind of one of the great benefits of interfaith.
Thank you for listening to the Y Magazine podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll probably also enjoy the episode Religious Freedom with Elizabeth Clark, Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at BYU. We'd love it if you'd tell your families and friends about this podcast. It really helps us grow and reach more people. This episode was produced by me, Whitney Archibald, with executive producer Brooklyn Romer. Original music, mixing, and mastering by Jarrett Davis.